Hi students, welcome to this session. The topic for presentation today is Physiology of Menstrual Cycle. Let's move on to the learning objectives. At the end of this session, the student should be able to explain the hypothalamo-pituitary-ovarian function, physiology of menstruation, including the two-cell 2-gonadotrophin theory, sequence of hormone changes during menstrual cycle, and also the endometrial changes in the menstrual cycle, including proliferative, secretory and menstrual phase. Let us see this diagram. This diagram shows the uterus with the menstrual cycle, the process of decidualization and process of repair. If you see the human endometrium, this is one of the physiological example of a wounded surface required to rapidly repair every month. Each month, the human endometrium is exposed to sequential pattern of circulating ovarian hormones, which includes estrogen and progesterone. Progesterone withdrawal leads to breakdown of this endometrium, whereas estrogen help in the regeneration process. Hypoxia likely to play a vital role in the endometrial repair process. This inflammation and the wound healing process continues every month. Function of a endometrium, uterine endometrium, is the main function includes preparation for implantation, to maintain the pregnancy if implantation occurs, and to menstruate in the absence of pregnancy. The pivotal process of this endometrium is mainly steroid regulated, and the endometrium is a complex multicellular steroid tissue. Absence of pregnancy sheds every month. What is menstruation? This is a visible manifestation of the cyclical physiological uterine bleeding due to shedding of the endometrium following an invisible interplay of the hormone through the hypothalamo-pituitary-ovarian axis. This period extending from the beginning of the period to the next one is called as menstrual cycle. In a normal menstrual cycle, orderly cyclical hormone production and parallel proliferation of the uterine lining prepares for the implantation of the embryo. In the absence of this implantation, it leads to menstrual cycle. Menstrual cycle has ovarian cycle and endometrial cycle. So, ovarian cycle will go in a line, and this is endometrial cycle is a mirror image of this ovarian cycle. So, follicular phase and luteal phase happens in the ovarian cycle. At the same time, you will be noting a proliferative phase and a secretory phase in the endometrial cycle. Let us move on to the next slide, hypothalamo-pituitary-ovarian function. If you see this diagram, so the pituitary at the apex, followed by the hypothalamus, the hormones from the hypothalamus initiate this process through the pituitary, these hormones acts on the ovary. So, that is this hypothalamo-pituitary-ovarian axis is the main key point in initiating this menstrual process. So, the GnRH pulse from the hypothalamus release pulsatile release of this gonadotrophin secretions. So, this leads to the stimulation of the follicular stimulating hormone and also the luteinizing hormone. So, these two get stimulated through the ovaries, and thereby the follicular recruitment and development happens in the ovary. So, once they reach this mid-cycle LH surge, leads to ovulation and formation of the corpus luteum. So, this follicular recruitment and development increases the level of estrogen and inhibin B, whereas this ovulation and the corpus luteal formation increases the production of the progesterone, estrogen and inhibin A. So, once these estrogen levels are increasing, the amount is increased more than a normal, it sends a negative feedback to this pituitary, thereby it causes the suppress the release of follicular stimulating hormone. The same way, the increasing levels of progesterone sends a negative feedback to this pituitary and inhibit the FSH LH production and leads to the initiation of the second menstrual cycle. So, the tonic and episodic secretion of these gonadotrophins in the prepubertal period is gradually changed to cyclical release in the postpubertal period. Increased amplitude and frequency of this GnRH increase the secretion of the ovarian follicle. The estrogen, a gonadal estrogen, is responsible for development of this uterus, vagina, vulva and breast development in the prepubertal age group. Let us see what is The thing about follicular stimulating hormone. Follicular stimulating hormone is a glycoprotein. It's stimulated by the GnRH production, mainly by pulsatile release of this GnRH. It's suppressed by estrogen and inhibin. Two peak levels during this menstrual cycle happens. One is the follicular phase at 6th day of the menstrual cycle. Next is a pre-ovulatory phase that happens on 12th day of the menstrual cycle. Let's see about follicular stimulating hormone. Follicular stimulating hormone is a glycoprotein. It's stimulated by the pulsatile release of this GnRH production and it's suppressed by estrogen and inhibin. So, it has two peaks during the menstrual cycle, one during the 6th day of the menstrual cycle, one before the pre-ovulatory phase, that is on the 12th day of menstrual cycle. Of this recruited follicle, one follicle has a higher number of FSH receptors and this destined to be the dominant follicle. The developing follicle produce increasing amount of estrogen and inhibin B. These hormones inhibit the FSH production by the gonadotrophin such as follicular stimulating hormone levels starts falling after reaching a peak on the 6th day of the menstrual cycle. FSH acts on the granulosa cells. Estrogen acts on the granulosa cell and it produces two hormones, estrogen and inhibin B. So, estrogen and inhibin B, the estrogen has a negative feedback on follicular stimulating hormone. So when estrogen is increased in amount, it causes the negative feedback, thereby the follicular stimulating hormone levels will come down. So, estrogen also sends a positive feedback for LH. So, when the estrogen levels are increased to an extent, then it causes increase in the LH level. Whereas, in inhibin B, it has a negative feedback on FSH. So, when the inhibin B level increases, it causes reduced in the level of follicular stimulating hormone. FSH acts on the granulosa cells and helps in the secretion of estrogen and inhibin B. Estrogen has a negative feedback on FSH levels and when the estrogen levels are raised, it causes reduced in FSH hormone and it has a positive feedback on LH. As the LH level increases and it again increases the luteinizing hormone level. Inhibin B, this has a negative feedback on FSH and reduces the FSH level as inhibin level increases. Estrogen has a positive feedback on LH and thereby it increases the LH level and cause LH surge. Sudden increase in LH surge initiated by the estrogen, if the estrogen levels equivalent of 200 picogram in this last 24 hours, helps in the formation of, helps in meiosis and it resumes. Acts on the theca cells and it produces the androgens in granulosa cells and adipose tissue, helps in converting it into estrogen. This also acts on the granulosa cells. Let us see about 2-cell 2-gonadotrophin hypothesis. Theca cells and granulosa cells, LH acting on the theca cells and FSH acting on the granulosa cells. Ovarian steroids are synthesized from a cholesterol through an interaction of a theca and granulosa cells. Cholesterol initially mobilized into the mitochondrial by steroidogenic acute regulatory protein where it is converted into pregnenolone by cholesterol side chain enzymes. Pregnenolone diffuse into the smooth endoplasmic reticulum and converted into progesterone by beta hydroxysteroid dehydrogenase and then it converted into testosterone. Whereas in granulosa cell, androstenedione and testosterone with the help of the aromatase is converted in estrone and estradiol. Role of LH and granulosa cells. It causes luteinization of the cells. Small amount of progesterone has a positive effect on LH and FSH. At low concentration of the progesterone, it increases the LH and FSH. At high concentration of the progesterone, decreases LH and FSH. Ovulation is a process of release of a oocyte from a ovarian follicle. As mentioned earlier, it occurs on the day 14 of the menstrual cycle. The process is triggered by mid-cycle LH surge. At this stage, the first mitotic division of a oocyte is completed and the first polar body is extruded. The oocyte is now haploid. The second meiotic division takes place only after fertilization, after which the second polar body is extruded. Now move on to our ovarian cycle. Ovarian cycle has a follicular phase. So, the hormonal feedback promotes the orderly development of the single dominant follicle, which should be mature at mid-cycle and prepared for ovulation. Average length of this human follicular phase range from 10 to 14 days. Primordial follicle, primary follicle, secondary follicle and formation of the corpus luteum. Let us see what is this primordial follicle. It is a single layer of flattened granulosa cell, as you see in this figure. It has a oocyte inside and the stromal cells covering it and the follicular cells lining this. So, let us see this next one. It is a unilaminar follicular, and where it has a basal lamina, zona pellucida formation is seen inside. Primary follicle has a cuboidal granulosa cell. Increase in number of this granulosa cells causes the pseudostratification and formation of this zona pellucida, that is seen in this diagram. Multilaminar primary follicle, this has a zona pellucida and it is covered by this granulosa cells all around, and there is a theca interna, as you see in this diagram. Secondary follicle, there is an increasing number of this granulosa cells and the preantral follicles. There is a stromal differentiation into this theca cells, as you see in this diagram with the yellow spots, and the formation of this theca externa and interna is also shown in this diagram. Tertiary follicle, it is also called as antral follicle. There is a collection of fluid inside, a rapid increase in the follicular size, formation of the cumulus vuferus and formation of corona radiata and formation of the Graafian follicle. As you see in this diagram, there is this pink color shade shows the antrum, and there is a theca interna in the inner lining, and there is a dark lines with a broad line which showed is a theca externa. And then you can see this thick closed arranged cells, granulosa cells as yellow in color in this. Mature Graafian follicle or a Graafian follicle, as you see here, it has a basement membrane, it has an antral filled fluid with a follicular fluid in the inner aspect, and theca follicle with the externa, theca externa and interna seen in the diagram, and there is a primary oocyte in the inner part of it, and these granulosa cells are compactly packed inside and covered with the corona radiata, and there is a zona pellucida, as you see in this diagram. This is a hormonal changes, and also it shows the ovarian cycle and endometrial cycle in a single graphical representation. It starts with the menstrual cycle 0 to 28-day cycle of a menstrual cycle. And as in the day first 0 to 4 to 5 days, during this menstrual cycle, there is a shedding of this endometrium, and there it starts growing slowly as the endometrial cycle is shown in this figure, that is a proliferative phase. During this proliferative phase, the follicles in the ovary also shows a follicular phase, and the slow maturation, the recruitment of the primary follicle, and slowly these primary follicles become secondary and tertiary. This takes place during this follicular phase. If you see this red color is a marking of a LH, and purple color is a mark of a follicular stimulating hormone, green is a mark of a estrogen, and blue color is again shows a progesterone. As you see in this cycle, and from this follicular and a proliferative phase, there is a slow increase during the process of the follicular recruitment. You can see there is a slow increase in this estrogen level, also there is a slow rise in this progesterone. And the LH, if you see, there is a steep inclination of this LH levels as it progresses towards this ovulation phase, and also this FH, there is a slow inclination, and after that it becomes plateau. During this luteal phase, you can see the rise in this progesterone level compared to this estrogen, and also there is this steep inclination of this LH just before this rupture of the ovarian corpus luteum is a sign of ovulation, and followed by this secretory phase after this ovulation, and the rupture of this Graafian follicle, release of this ovum, and happens during this luteal phase. So, this is a graphical representation, shows the in the x-axis the days are marked, in y-axis the hormone levels, the follicular stage in this ovarian cycle, and the endometrial cycle is marked in this y-axis. So, during the process of the menstrual cycle, the proliferative phase starts in this just after the menstruation in the endometrium. The same time, one of this dominant follicle is chosen in this ovarian cycle, and that continue to increase in size from primary to secondary to tertiary ovum. And the hormone levels, again if you see there is an inclination in your LH, inclination in your FSH level, and this estrogen level slowly increases. The progesterone peaks just before the ovulation. And the luteal phase is the phase after the ovulation, after this corpus luteum is formed, after this Graafian follicle ruptures and release the ovum, this phase continues. During the same time in endometrium, the secretory phase continues, and this LH peak just before the ovulation you can appreciate in the reddened line. As you all see, the ovulation is the process of release of the oocyte from a ovarian follicle. As mentioned earlier, it occurs on the day 14th of the menstrual cycle. The process is triggered by mid-cycle LH surge. At this stage, the first meiotic division of the oocyte is completed and the first polar body is extruded. Oocyte is now haploid. The second meiotic division happens after the fertilization process. This is the process of ovulation as I explained earlier. Ovulation is a process of release of oocyte from ovarian follicle. It happens on 14th day. The oocyte is now haploid. The second meiotic division takes place only after the fertilization. Next is our luteal phase. Luteal phase of the ovarian cycle is the period that extends from the time of formation of the corpus luteum to the onset of the menses or luteolysis. Usually it is 14 days in length. This is a constant length of this luteal phase of the menstrual cycle remains constant. Formation of a corpus luteum. The luteal phase of the ovarian cycle is the period that extends from the time of formation of the corpus luteum to the onset of the menstruation, that is luteolysis. Usually it is constant and it is 14 days in length. There are 4 phases of corpus luteal development. The first is proliferation, second vascularization, third maturation, and fourth one is a regression. Luteolysis, what it means? It refers to the degeneration of the corpus luteum, which takes place in the late luteal phase unless pregnancy occurs. The blood supply to the corpus luteum decreases, the hormone production ceases, the cells become fibrotic and resulting in the structure called corpus albicans. Luteolysis refers to the degeneration of the corpus luteum, which takes place in the late luteal phase unless pregnancy occurs. If the pregnancy continues, then corpus luteum continue to function till 6 weeks of pregnancy. The blood supply to the corpus luteum decreases, the hormone production ceases, the cells become fibrotic and resulting structure is called as corpus albicans. What happens in the endometrial cycle? Endometrium, again it has a superficial functional layer as you see here and a deep basal layer. This superficial functional layer has stratum functionalis of the endometrium. As you see in this diagram, that superficial one, the stratum basalis of the endometrium, the second layer, and a portion of the myometrium. So, a deep basal layer, the lumen of the uterus, epithelium, uterine glands, lamina propria is a connective tissue inside, and the smooth muscle fibers. These are the deep basal layers. During each menstrual cycle, only the superficial functional layers shed during this menstrual cycle. Deep basal layer continue to stay back and it's continue to proliferate. Menstrual phase. With the demise of the corpus luteum, the level of estrogen and progesterone fall. There is a local production of this prostaglandin F2 alpha causing vasospasm of the spiral arteries, endometrial ischemia and tissue destruction. The endometrium breaks down and the functional layer is shed, expelled by the myometrial contraction. This continues every month. The degeneration and shedding process rapidly during the first 2 days. Vasoconstriction and myometrial contractility are regulated by prostaglandin F2 alpha, prostaglandin E2, prostaglandin I2 and thromboxane. Prostaglandin F2 alpha and thromboxane are the vasoconstrictors, whereas prostaglandin E2 and I2 are the vasodilators. Proliferative endometrium. Proliferative phase extends from day 1 to 14 in a 28-day cycle. During this menstruation, the entire functional layer is shed under the influence of estrogen and regeneration of the lining cells, glands, stroma takes place and proceeds rapidly. This high level of mitotic activity and the glands become elongated and lining cells are low columnar. This endometrium is only 1 to 2 millimeter thick. The late proliferative phase, the lining cells undergo pseudostratification and glands appear tubular and dilated. So, as you see in this diagram, this shows the early proliferative phase, late proliferative and secretory phase. As you see in this diagram, the functionalis layer and the basalis layer and the myometrium are highlighted in this diagram. As you see this, during the secretory phase, this functional layer is very big, it's increased in size, the vascularity is high and the secretory glands are seen in this as compared to this early proliferative phase. So, the blue color is capillaries and red and blue are the capillaries and venous sinus, and the brown color is endometrial glands and spiral arteries are shown here, and the basal artery as you go down in this. As you all know, the uterine artery divides into arcuate, radial and basal artery and spiral arteries, and we will move on to the next. It is about the proliferative phase. The lining epithelium, lamina propria, colloid arteries, uterine glands. This forms the superficial endometrium. Smooth muscles and smooth muscle with its cross section are seen in this myometrium. So, the above layer is a functional layer and the bottom one is a basal layer and the rest of the thing is a connective tissue and blood vessels as you go down into this myometrium. What happens in the secretory phase? Secretory phase extends from 15th day to till 28th day of a cycle. The duration of the secretory phase is constant, does not vary even if the cycle length varies. Progesterone acts on this endometrium only if it is already primed with estrogen. This concept is very important in all the gynecological perspective. Only the estrogen primed endometrium will respond to the progesterone. Secretory changes takes place under the influence of the progesterone. The first sign of secretory change is the appearance of the secretions in the form of subnuclear vacuoles in the cells lining the gland. This is considered to be the indication of ovulation. Then again, this is very important to note. Let us see about secretory phase. So, secretory phase, if you see in this diagram, it shows a columnar epithelium and uterine glands with secretions you can appreciate in this. The lamina propria also shows edematous changes and you can appreciate also the coiled arteries in this. Uterine glands are hypertrophied and they are tortuous. So, this happens during the process of secretory phase, and in the functional layer, if you appreciate, you can all appreciate the length of this functional layer also increased, and in the myometrium you can see the smooth muscle bundles and also uterine glands with hypertrophy in the basal layer. The glands become tortuous and corkscrew shaped and the stroma become edematous. The spiral arteries elongate and have a coiled appearance. By 21st day of the cycle, the division of the compact and spongy layer become very distinct. Stroma is infiltrated with the leukocytes towards and late secretory phase. The glands become sharp-toothed and this is followed by menstruation. So, we have come to the last slide. Implantation takes place on day 4 at the blastocyst stage. The trophotoderm of the blastocyst adhere to this prepared endometrium. This is facilitated by the endometrial integrins, adhesion proteins and osteopotin and several other substances produced by endometrium. Continued progesterone secretion is by the corpus luteum play a major role in the production of this regulation. This continues for the next 6 weeks till the placenta takes over the role. This is the picture of a menstrual phase and proliferative and secretory phase on the x-axis, with the y-axis showing the functional and basal layer. You all can appreciate how this glands enlarge in length, how this secretory endometrium with a lot of glands and blood vessels are seen as the menstrual cycle advances. So, in this slide we can see a menstrual phase, proliferative and secretory in the x-axis and the uterine cycle in y-axis. So, you can all appreciate the functional layer in the menstrual cycle is very small compared to the functional layer in the secretory and proliferative phase. Same way, the glands and ducts and vessels are also keep increasing as it becomes a proliferative phase. With that, we will conclude our session. We hope you understood. Thank you.